I'm Ingrid Monson, Director of the Jazz Research Initiative at the Hutchins Center, and our idea behind this particular panel, and it's a lurking idea behind the whole conference, is the theme of history and Geri Allen's place in the history. And Geri Allen's place is part of a history that has yet to be told about generations of jazz musicians who've come up since the 1980s. Most of jazz scholarship deals with things much earlier, and there is a living tradition here, and our commitment to documenting this conference is part of wanting to tell the story of what's taken place, and there's never any better way to do that than to talk to the musicians who have been a part of this. And so we're very, very fortunate to have our group of panelists, Dwight Andrews, who's professor of music theory and African American music at Emory University, a fabulous reed man, a fabulous composer who has done all sorts of work with film scoring, and he's a reverend as well. And Don Byron, currently professor of music at Metropolitan State University at Denver, known to you all as the preeminent clarinetist, a wonderful composer. His most recent project, you may have seen it, is he did the score to Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart, the recent documentary about Lorraine Hansberry. And of course, Professor Vijay Iyer, my esteemed colleague here at Harvard, and also a fabulous pianist, composer. I can't say enough great things about what a wonderful colleague he is, and how having his presence here has enabled us to just up our game. So, welcome. So,
I could welcome you.
Okay.
Ingrid Monson.
Okay. But in the theme of this, I was just hoping that people could talk a little bit, about the jazz scene in the 80s, when Geri was coming up, and what New York in that time period looked like then. What were the challenges that faced musicians coming of age in that time period?
Should I start?
Yeah.
I think the thing about the 80s, when the 80s start, I'm here, and I'm seeing everything from afar. We were in school together. The old cats are still alive. I played gigs with Dizzy, with Mario Bowser, with Mercer Ellington. When I got to New York, those guys were still alive. So at a certain, almost economic level, you move to New York, you're competing with those people. The older cats were still playing the Vanguard. Now Guillermo Klein is playing the Vanguard. But there was that, and then a kind of game about authenticity that people were playing. Like, were you really a jazz musician? Were you really avant-garde? Were you really playing fusion? Fusion was the worst thing that you could play. It's like, absolutely, are you fusion? So like, I have reviews of my stuff from the early 90s. It's like, well, it comes dangerously close to fusion, Dangerous, like fusion is dangerous. And all of those things really discounted your authenticity with a lot of people. Like, if you are open to the avant-garde, not even like you were a card-carrying member, but if you would play a little free to somebody that didn't, you weren't a jazz musician, because that's not the way that they defined it. And now, now everybody's connected on Facebook. People I went to school with that wouldn't know Cecil Taylor from a hole in the wall, now they're Don Moyer's friend on Facebook. The thing was very narrow. And when I came to New York, what I was about, and I think what I saw in Geri and the M-Bass people, was that they were trying to get to what I referred to at the time as the dirty black shit. Who would be the dirty black shit? It would be Don Pullen, Don Cherry, people that could, definitely had a kind of harmonic language that they could speak fluently and yet we're open to this other side. And now we look, and almost everybody's doing that. But I think in the 80s, almost nobody was doing that. You know, and you were, you know, all the things that made you disqualified and avant-garde, liking some classical music made you avant-garde. You know, it was like everything was this trap that led you to this direction where somebody that played your instrument or somebody that didn't could say, oh, well, that's not really what's really happening. And, you know, for me, I came from an instrument that by its nature is an orchestral instrument, it's classical. I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand why some critic was up in my grill talking about why did I play Robert Schumann. You know, I just didn't understand it because those people weren't really around when I was being educated. So you come to New York, and then there's this kind of critical mass of people just thinking completely wrong, and then went and frankly riding the crest of that wrongness and saying, I am what's right, and what everyone else is doing is different stuff. So, you know, when I first heard the M bass, and you know, maybe it's not fair to think about Geri as an M bass artist, but it was the first time I heard her. What we, you know, I remember we were on, a bunch of us were in certain bands, and we would see them on the road. Me, Ralph Peterson, Brandon Ross, Kenny Davis. We would see the M bass guys, like, man, those guys can all play changes. They, you know, like, and a lot of people were missing that at the time, that they were all very well-rounded. You know, and I think for me, what I think was unique about the way that Geri did it, if I think about a pianist like Eddie Palmieri will be playing some, you know, nice folk kind of like Hebrew kind of thing for a minute, and then all of a sudden, you know. And Geri was more like, it was just all in the cauldron. Yeah. You know, and you know, because a lot of what she played, I thought, was very much like out of very basic materials. And then every once in a while, just this bubbling of weirdness would just emit from her, and then it would be replaced by something else. It was all very democratic. You know, it was all very democratic, and it was done. In fact, I think, you know, Terry was saying that she was a feminine musician. I think that the way that the things mixed was very feminine. It wasn't like she played soft and that was feminine. I think that the way that the various aspects of her emitted had a feminine quality to her. You know, because you know, there's some people, you know, like somebody like Don Pullen, you know, all of a sudden he's playing normal and boom, 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 boom. It wasn't like that. It was more like. And from the first time I played with her to the last time I played with her to the stuff that I saw her play, it was always like that. Always like that. And to me, that's her feminine quality. Not, you know, I mean, her personality, of course, but, you know, there was a feminine quality the way that she mixed the dirty black stuff with the straight ahead stuff, with stuff that was none of the above. It wasn't violent, wasn't nasty, wasn't against anybody. That, which I think is a key thing, because some people, like, to me, Steve Coleman's stuff is like Charlie Parker stuff. It's against, it's against what you think. It's against what you assume. She wasn't against anything. In fact, if you talk like that around her, she'd shut you down. She'd shut you down. She'd shut you down. Very, very, and you know, that would be kind of harsh when she'd shut you down, you know.
That's true. Yeah, there's been so much said over the last 2 days. I mean, I feel like my cup is like overflowing because, and I thought I knew Geri very well, but there's so much that we don't know, that part of what I hope will come out of this gathering is a way to further answer all of the questions, or at least begin to ask the right questions because of all of the ways in which knowledge is shared with all of these wonderful colleagues of hers. For me, knowing Geri in the 70s as a teenager, as a high school student, and then watching her evolution, I think what I think about is she had an album, I think, called Open on All Sides.
Yes.
And Geri was open on all sides. Craig said it yesterday. She inherited in Detroit, all the cats were playing all the different kinds of music. I mean, Marcus was not just playing with Ray Charles. He was playing all those Motown sessions, and he was doing his own thing. So there was a way in which I think her upbringing in Detroit helps to explain her vast interest in the world. She went to Cass, which was a great high school, which I claim. But she was in that harp and vocal thing and the madrigal thing and all of the other classical things because she just wanted to absorb it all. She was open on all sides, always. And so in some ways, when she came to New York, she was running contrary to the canon setting that was going on. I mean, because everybody had the camp and are you in or are you out? And, you know, without mentioning any names, we see all the problems that came out of all of that kind of boundary setting at a time when Geri came and was very, very much open to playing with anybody, listening to anybody, learning everybody, which is why her career is so unusual. When you think about all of the cats that she played with in so many different, what we call separated communities, Geri was really the bridge to many, many different musicians, from Ornette to Oliver to, I mean, to you, to me, to everyone. She had this incredible breadth of perspective. So when I think about Geri, I think part of what makes her kind of special in that decade was she was coming on the scene at a time when she was very, very much still open. She had her own language even when she got there. But she was very, very much open into discovering all of the things that were to be discovered. And I think that if we can figure out a way to extend this conversation beyond this weekend, I think we all know as academics that if it's not written about, if it's not discussed, if it's not challenged, if it's not put in a book, then she will disappear. And so I'm hoping that we'll find ways to kind of document this conversation so that we'll get a chance to further reflect on Geri's influences. Several people talked about her West African interests and her ethnomusicology, but she was also deeply into Stravinsky, which was my thing. And so she knew that music, she knew the piano music. If you listen to her carefully, you'll hear Stravinsky's piano music and her language. But she was always, I call her a funketeer, because she was always grooving in any meter, any time. And that's because she was open to all of it. So I think we don't fully understand her legacy yet. But what today and yesterday did for me was I have like a whole book of questions. I want to find out a little bit more about this, a little bit more about that, a little bit more about her time with Ornette. And, we talked about Ornette, but never in the terms that we talked about it. And so there are just so many wonderful questions that I think we can ask as colleagues that will, in a sense, help us to understand what her legacy is, not just to the 80s, but to now. The final thing that I was thinking about is the way in which, as Mount said so powerfully today, I never really fully appreciated Geri's relationship with the technology. I mean, I knew she did it, but it was her vision that saw on the other side of those possibilities a way in which she is, once again, a nurturer, right? She brings the technology to all those places that don't have ways to connect with these various communities. And from that panel, we learned a little bit more about the trajectory of her understanding of what was possible. So I hope that we can kind of further unpack all of that because she's such an important voice that I think she deserves our further study and reflection.
Or I'll jump in.
Yeah, I want to, you don't have to answer this right away, but I do want to ask about this this pressure that you kind of mentioned, or you described, Don, that was taking place in New York in the 80s to conform to this or that camp. And I wonder if how much of it was imposed by critics or industry forces versus by artists. But we can get into that. But when thinking about histories, like a lot of what's come up in the last 24 hours in these conversations is the phrase that comes to mind is attributed to Homi Bhabha, who's, I guess we're in his house right now. Or something.
Yes.
And the phrase is affective histories, which is to say not necessarily what is documented on recordings and in books and so forth, but affect in the sense of how one affects and is affected by others. Affect also in the sense of emotion, and so I just think about what you were talking about, Dawn, earlier as a kind of New York was a cauldron, right? And still, it continues to be in a maybe in a different way from how it was 30 years ago or 35 years ago. But you have a lot of forces swirling around, and those are being produced by individuals, by communities, by institutions. I remember Geri actually referred to it once when she and I were talking. She said, it's interesting to see how you navigate these waters. That was the way she saw it. It's kind of like we're all sailing or swimming or whatever we're doing in this cauldron or this sea or this kind of this swirl of forces that are fluid, that aren't fixed, that keep changing. And the other thing is, like, Dawn is actually, that was the first time in these days that in this conference that anyone referred to M-Bass, which was it was a collective of a loose collective of musicians. We associated with Steve Coleman, Greg Osby, Gary Thomas, Graham Haynes, Cassandra Wilson, and Geri, and several others. And they all had what you could call jazz bona fides. Like you said, they could play changes, they could deal with form and with structure, and they wanted to. Like, it's not even that they could, it's that they cared enough to actually incorporate that into their music too. But it was also that they were influenced by James Brown and by the Supremes and by Stevie Wonder, and that they were fearless with current technologies, with what was at hand, whether it was the off-the-rack Yamaha DX7 synthesizers or drum machines or working with DJs, and also working across media, working with MCs and poets and dancers. And so that's, what I mentioned yesterday was there was, to me, Geri kind of showed up when I was a teenager in the 80s as something like a futurist. That's how it seemed to me, being like a kid from the suburbs who was an undergrad and trying to make sense of all of this. And I remember at the time I was an undergrad at Yale, and I was subscribing to the Village Voice, and at the time there were ongoing columns from Greg Tate and from Gary Giddens, who represented to me two very different perspectives on the music of that period and on the culture of that period. Giddens was maybe asserting this unity around this field called jazz, and Greg Tate was kind of breaking it pretty wide open as one of the founders of the Black Rock Coalition. And so that was another community or collective that Geri was associated with, the Black Rock Coalition. I remember when we played at her funeral last summer, there was like Muzz Scullins and all these guys from Living Color, and so there were all these different crews that she was associated with, and it didn't seem, like you said, that she wanted to forsake any of it or push any of it away or say that any of it was off limits, but more to find a unified way of dealing with all of it. And that's kind of, when I think of affective history, is how that was carried forward into the music. You know, one thing that was pointed out when she passed is that, so there's a generation of piano players. So people like Herbie Hancock and, I don't know, Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett, McCoy Tyner, they're all in their 70s now. And then there was a wave of musicians like, so I'm going to name 3 names who were all, to us in the 80s and early 90s, like the forces. Like this was the future of the music. And it was Mulgrew Miller, Kenny Kirkland, and Geri Allen. And they're all gone. That's kind of shocking to think about, that that was the core of the next generation of piano playing. And they've all passed very young, which is a kind of gaping hole in the continuity, in the intergenerational continuity that we associate with this music. Each of them representing a very different sensibility and approach and affect, I think. So I think it's important to understand Geri on that level as one of the influential pianists who suddenly we're sort of scrambling to assess in retrospect, sort of that caught us off guard, the fact that we have to do it so soon. But that's true also of those other 2. And then to think of her as someone who moved really across these communities in a way that was that seemed unfettered in a way, at a time when, as you were saying, it seemed like boundary lines were being drawn.
Yes. And, I could add, picking up a little bit on what Farah had to say, I mean, that part of that sensibility is understanding that all African American musics are interconnected, and you can connect outside that as well. And she was such a pioneer in doing that. I want to think a little bit of my scholarly hat about thinking about history. And Don taught, and I like to, in talking about previous history, I like to talk about what's structural going on, what's, how musicians are dealing with whatever structures they're facing, and what they're thinking and feeling about it. And Don, I think you talked about a really important thing to remember about the 80s, that all these people were still living. Yeah. Dizzy, Sun Ra, and competing with it. I once heard Michael Kuskuna say, and then all the generation of the 90s comes up, CDs are invented, and all the young musicians are having to compete with selling CDs with the Coltrane CDs and the Miles Davis CDs, and their CDs cost more because they were made now. I mean, so this is sort of one aspect of just the economic situation that musicians were facing at that time. I also think that there's a special quality to those musicians who did get to play with some of those elders and carry that message into the next generation. That part of what we need to do, it seems to me, this is my appeal to musicians, is we don't want to have to rely on the critics in writing the history. Yes, many of the things are very valuable in things, but the interpretation, the meaning of that within the broader community of what is jazz performance is the thing that I would like to see go into future scholarship about it. Dwight, I think you were speaking a little bit to that also.
Yeah, I think that in some ways, for me, the power of the music is that it's self-affirming. Mm-hmm. I mean, jazz has never depended on the critic to be jazz.
Yes.
And in a sense, the story is the story of people who can affirm, I played it like that because that's the way I like it, and that's legitimate. And it's in that self-affirmation that I think gets lost sometimes when we think about who's the next important voice. Because all of these people are affirming not only the tradition, which is why Geri forced every one of her students to understand that they come through something, but that you have to have your own voice to affirm what it is you stand for and who you are. And so I think that many of the musicians that that feel called to make great music do not live by a critic or by a label or by a record. They live by making the music. I knew an actor once who didn't get a lot of work in New York, and he said, I act because that's the only thing I want to do. I just want to act. And I'm willing to do whatever I can do to act, because that's where my heart lies. And so they weren't worried about getting a sitcom or a movie. You know, I mean, they wanted to just work and tried to stay ready to work. And so I worry about the present moment in the sense because I think it's harder now, ironically, for musicians to not only find their own voice, but to navigate the waters of the present moment in terms of not just being mentored, but places to perform and places to aggregate and to share, which is one of the strengths of the 80s. I mean, there are a lot of communities meeting in those places in Brooklyn, different people's homes, you know, making rehearsals and just making the music even before the gigs were coming or the notoriety was coming. And I think that that's been always a triumphant aspect of the music. The music is being made. Even when people didn't listen to Wadada, he was still making music. He wasn't waiting on a critic to understand what he was doing. And when you think about that scene that Mike was writing about, that was a scene in which musicians were saying, we're going to make this music because this is what's to be made.
You know, I think in jazz, it's very hard to like just be very Afrocentric, but that Afrocentrism was being tested both by what the critics were saying and what Wynton was saying with them. And let me just make it clear what I think about that. I think he exploited their racism to promote himself. Their being against an Afrocentric approach and a pan-African approach that would include James Brown and whatever. That they're being against that. He exploited that and said the same things that they had probably been saying about him just a few years before. People don't want to remember that white folks did not like Wynton. They were like, you're not a jazz musician. They would say that to him. And that was said in print, said to his face. And so he just turned it around and he said, they're not jazz, and I am. But to me, the BRC is very important. I mean, I remember in the 80s, everybody worked at Tower Records. I mean, everybody. It was like Tim Byrne, John Zorn, Melvin Gibbs. Everybody was working at Tower Records. All the white guys, what they were trying to do was get their shit in the classical department because they knew that shit paid. So they were all, you know, John Zorn's like, I've written a concert work and this is what's happening. The brothers, what they were dealing with was that the ground floor of Tower Records had no black music in it except Joan Armatrading and Prince. Joan Armatrading, Prince, and Hendrix.
Yeah, that's right.
That's, you know, so the main floor, and then there was this like mezzanine that
Yes,
had
I
like
remember
a low
that.
ceiling, and that's where all the Motown stuff was. That's where all the Motown, I mean, people think it's nuts now, but that's really the way it was.
It was,
That's
yes.
the way it was that all of this stuff was super segregated. Like super segregated. And I remember I go in there, and Melvin Gibbs would just be like, we got to get this shit out of the mezzanine. We got to do something about it. So, I mean, I don't even think there was really a choice as a black musician in terms of your at least being sympathetic to the BRC. On the other hand, the BRC really didn't love jazz that much. They didn't really like it that much. So they never really embraced, you know, Tate wrote occasionally about jazz, but that wasn't his thing. His thing was kind of signifying about what was the blackest stuff, and jazz wasn't the blackest stuff. I think a lot of African American, even scholars, stay away from jazz because it's not such a clear answer. Is it black music or really? Or no, it's not really. Oh, what about Paul Bley? Oh, you know what I mean? Okay. But to me, all of us seem to have a relationship with the BRC, and all of those musicians were all sprinkled through the jazz thing, but the idea didn't have to be explained at all.
Right.
Not at all. Mm-hmm. What was happening here was that the business was absolutely segregated. You know, like I made records that were completely not jazz, and they would always end up in the jazz band. And white guys, they could, you know, like I told you, John Zorn and them, they were trying to like, if it's ethnic, it's here. If it's classical, it's here. If it's improvised, it's here. And we get to make all these different monies from all these different people that follow these musics. Mm-hmm. For black folks, it wasn't really like that.
Right.
It wasn't really like that. And a lot of the stuff that I've been through, I mean, I couldn't even get my klezmer record in the ethnic section of Tower Records. and when I was doing the klezmer shit, all of a sudden they would throw other klezmer records in my bin, in the jazz section. So we can make money off you, but you can't make money off us.
Right.
And when you think about funk and the richness of it, and then the way it was being written about, Watrous was the worst. Watrous once wrote a thing in the Sunday Times where he never, first of all, he never mentioned a white musician, but like it was all about fusion. And in his list of the evil fusion were Joe Henderson, George Russell.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it was just like,
Lord.
wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Is this really what you think? You think that George Russell? How about Jeff Lorber? You know, that was never mentioned. The Brecker Brothers were still playing the same music, and he never mentioned them. Never mentioned David Sanborn. But all the Negroes were just displayed who'd ever played a backbeat. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And this is what we were dealing with. Mm-hmm. This is really what we were dealing with, was somebody that didn't know nothing about you.
Yeah.
Telling you what to play. And she just, you know, I mean, I didn't want to get too far from Geri. Geri just, she knew how to do that, and she wasn't fighting anybody. I was more of a fighter. I would go up in Watrous's grill and tell him he was full of shit. And I paid for that. Geri didn't do that. But somehow, she just had this kind of, it would all just flow through her. But, you know, the 80s were, I thought they were very difficult. And I think people need to write more about where black musicianship was being challenged in that period. You know what I mean? You know, Miles is playing, but, you know, all the times is dissing him. Yeah. He's still playing. He's still making good music. And they can't use it.
Yeah.
You know, and Wynton going up to Miles on the stage and whipping out his horn. That's what the 80s were like.
Wow.
That was what the 80s. Wynton showing up at
Lester Bowie.
Lester Bowie's gig with Watrous and Crouch and challenging him in the middle of his gig.
Wow.
You know, that's what the 80s were like. That's what the 80s were like.
Yeah, I think it took a toll on Geri, but not externally. I mean, I think she also had to navigate all of these different allegiances and litmus tests. But I think part of her grace was that she was able to kind of try to struggle through some of these things quite privately and quite quietly, so as to not be a distraction to her many collaborators and colleagues, and to the world around her. But I think it also took a toll because she was trying to figure out a lot of that stuff in a very quiet, private way, and it was much bigger than we could negotiate by ourselves. I mean, I think she had conversations. I think she was very, very conscious of all of the dynamics, but she was trying to figure out how to negotiate that internally inside, which is a lot about who she was.
So I was just remembering this. I mentioned this yesterday that John Zwed was teaching a class on post-war history of jazz at Yale when I was an undergrad, and he brought Geri, so that was when I first met her, which was 89 or 90. But the week before, he brought you. I don't know if you remember that you came up and did a workshop. He had 3 artists of that moment. You were the youngest. The other 2 were Julius Hemphill and Paul Bley. Do you remember this? And it was, and I remember that, my friends and I were all very affected by all of it. Like each one of you had such a strong purposefulness and your own vision that was, and they're also, it's seemingly so different from one another. And then I remember, so then like a week or 2 later, Geri Allen shows up and someone asked her about her relationship to tradition versus innovation. Because Paul Bley was pulling this sort of thing where he, in his workshop, he said, I just empty my mind and I'm trying not to play from any influence whatsoever. I'm like, yeah, okay. You say so, pal. So someone asked her if she ever tries to create from that space. I don't know, whatever. We were teenagers, so I don't know how. We didn't put it in any kind of sophisticated way. But she said, well, and this is after she had just like floored us all with a solo version of When Kabuya Dances or something.
Yeah.
And she says, well, I'm someone who embraces tradition, so she just like trailed off, like there was nothing more to say after that, she didn't, the question didn't make sense. So that was a kind of interesting, I suppose that it speaks to a certain set of divides that had emerged around that time. A lot of it was racialized, some of it was generational, some of it was aesthetic. But I wonder if, you're talking about the critics and about Winton, but it seems like there were more layers to it. Maybe either of you, if you have more.
Well, I think on the side of the artists and the musicians, the irony of the 80s for me is that some of the most broadly knowledgeable young artists were coming on the scene who really were multilingual. I mean, Byron, Geri, these were people who were not just kind of interested in other musics. They knew and understood other musics and repertoires and embraced it all. And I think, one, that's difficult for a critical establishment, which is looking for a zone to put you in, racially or otherwise, intellectually, aesthetically. But I think part of the irony of the 80s was that you had musicians with a very, very wide lens who knew and understood quite well these multiple layers of traditions that they wanted to embrace at the same time. And the critical establishment had no mechanism for dealing with that.
Exactly.
So they either put you out or put you in or put you someplace. But to me, the most interesting thing about the 80s was the new generation of young intellects who did not want to make choices but wanted to synthesize all of these. Don was an enigma for me because he played classical music so well. It's because he knew it. It was not an accident. But he was also very interested in bringing that all to the moment. And so I find that a very fascinating aspect about that generation because it was perhaps, in many ways, the next generation of really well-prepared musicians.
And I just want to thank Don for, just raising the racial stuff as deep as it was. And I sort of lived through the 80s with Don. We played in the Klezmer Conservatory Band together, and I watched what you faced in order to establish yourself within New York. And I remember totally respecting the fact that you weren't going to try to fit into one of those niches that everybody seemed to expect. And I saw these things, we'd be at klezmer gigs and somebody would walk up to Don and ask him if he read music.
Wow.
That just completely blew my mind, because I knew Don to be one of the most literate, creative musicians, knowledgeable and trained, just like, Dwight was saying, that so many of the musicians from this era were, and everybody wanted to put them into a box. and especially if you were black. And there was no escaping the box of some kind of way, and you had to figure out some way to handle it. And so watching Geri handle it, I watched you handle it in the 80s, and looking at how different musicians since that time have handled it. Because, you know, one thing that, it's not like any of this racial nonsense is over.
No.
It's different.
It's different.
It's different, but it's not over.
No.
Well, what I've noticed about both Geri and you, Dawn, and you too, Dwight, is that you all sort of play a long game with respect to these kinds of forces that would pigeonhole you, in the sense of making creative choices that might take a while to realize, but as they add up, then you see that there's a much broader vision that no label can contain. And that's that to me what has been an inspiration from the whole generation of creative musicians that you both, all three of you, represented. And for me, coming in, you know, trying to make sense of it all, passing through New York and trying to come check you guys out at that time in the late 80s, early 90s, as suddenly these new paradigms were emerging. There was a thing called young lions all of a sudden, and they dressed different, they played different, and it was a version of the past that was. Meanwhile, you had all these elders who were still around. So then it was like, well, what's the purpose? What function is this fulfilling? You know, because we already have intergenerational continuity. I mean, that's how one learns to be in this music and to be among one another, right? And so suddenly there was this kind of rupture, I guess, that was it really hasn't been fully assessed or addressed from the perspective of, say, political economy or aesthetics, like what it did. And so now, you know, you do see these kinds of patterns in the way. I mean, I'm sure that among us, we've had thousands of record reviews and thousands of concert reviews, like among, you know, and so you start to see these patterns. And I mean, we could do data analysis. We could like build word clouds, you know, and I think that'd be a good project for somebody if you guys. But you know, I can also say that of the hundreds or maybe 1,000 odd record reviews that I've had over a quarter century, that about 10 of them have been by people of color, and maybe about 4 of them have been by women. You know, and so it's really that the stories that are being told are reinforcing a certain set of assumptions about difference.
Yeah. So that's a real invitation, isn't it, for us to kind of continue to create and to nurture the next generation of writers and critics and thinkers, because that is a gaping absence. And so, you know, if you don't have people who have an appreciation and at least an understanding or an empathy with the traditions, then you will continue to get written on the page a warped understanding of what the music really is. I heard a paper last week in Atlanta about Dave Brubeck and sonic whiteness, and it was a paper that looked at white critics looking at Dave Brubeck and how they racially kind of assessed his work, and those same critics assessing Baggs and the Modern Jazz Quartet.
Wow.
And it talked about the coded language.
Yes.
Yeah. And which was very, very interesting, right?
No doubt.
And so there's a powerful story to be unpacked in all of that, because, you know, as Baraka reminded us, I mean, the role of the white critic in black jazz is palpable.
Yes.
And we haven't really moved that far from creating a kind of generation of writers and thinkers about this music. I mean, Farah is a wonderful sign of a way of thinking about music and culture that I think allows the people to be whole.
Yes.
And I think that there's perhaps an open door there as well. It's very powerful what you
Yes.
said. Yeah.
You know, I wanted to mention one thing that I did with Geri that I think really summed it up, which was the Robert Altman movie Kansas City, which had everybody in it. I mean, the two bass players were Christian McBride and Ron Carter. There's Joshua Redman. I mean, it was just ridiculous. But somebody got the idea that the musical director and the arranger of it should be Butch Morris. Spicy idea. A spicy idea because in there you had Nicholas Payton and Russell Malone and who was the other? Mark Whitfield. And somehow Butch thought that he could conduction and it was going to sound like old Kansas City music. So he got there's some cats that are like 60, 70 years old. There's the Whitnights. There's the kind of people that would be open to that, of which I kind of consider myself one. But Geri and Butch, James Zoller, I can't remember who the trombone section was, but literally, Butch stood up in front of the band, and he said, "The music's in the stick." That's the way he talked. "The music's in the stick." And I saw Nicholas, I mean, they must have been planning this. Nicholas Payton and a few of the other guys, they just took their chairs and they did this. I mean, we're in full costume in a movie set with white folks watching. And these motherfuckers actually thought that they could humiliate Butch. You know, we had film rolling, and we're doing this, and they did that. And to me, you know, like I think about Nicholas Payton, I think he's like a guy from a small town who's a great musician. But the lack of civility that seemed to emanate from the critics, it wasn't just the critics. I guess this is my point, is it wasn't just the critics, because a lot of people that got on that Young Lions went and vibe, they were expecting to get paid from that. You know, okay, like let's talk about Marx and stuff. They expected wage hour, you know, they expected to get paid from wearing cheap ass suits and talking about the tradition. They expected to get paid from that. And people like Butch and Geri and, you know, like they couldn't even figure out what we were thinking. They just seemed really puzzled. I remember my favorite moment in that thing wasn't so much Geri, because as usual, she stayed under the radar. But Olu Dara and Nicholas Payton having to play together. And Nicholas just looking at Olu Dara, and you could just tell he was like, what the hell is this? What the hell is this? And then Olu played more authentically than everybody else. But just, it wasn't within Nicholas's vibe that somebody that even looked or felt like Olu could have the breadth of knowledge that he had. And this is a musician, so we're talking about white critics. Of course, they don't know nothing. But the musicians were making those mistakes also. The musicians made those mistakes also. I remember me and Geri, you know, like nobody wanted to talk to Butch, so me and Geri would sit there and eat with him. He was there the whole time. You know, he just got the press, his single malts, and he was just sitting there tossing them back, and we had to sit with, you know, and just the lack of civility. You know, critics can be uncivil, and that's their nature. And somebody like Crouch, he's the ultimate of that. But like several of the other cats were just as uncivil about their comments about what we were doing in the period. But you know, if you grew up with some home training, you don't do that to other black people. You don't do that. But the whole thing was headed in that direction. The whole thing was headed in that direction where people were confronting each other or felt betrayed because you knew something or you liked something or you played something. It was just odd.
Wow.
Well, before we finish, are there questions from the audience?
Ms. Lindy.
I just appreciate
That's right.
Yes,
Byron.
here's to Don. Woo!
For real.
tell it like it is.
Yes.
From having known it and lived it,
Right.
and for helping us to understand where we are and how we got here.
That's right.
And perhaps you even have the answer to where we're going and how to get there.
Yes, indeed.
We're already there.
I sincerely thank you for kind of expanding this dialogue to include matters that we are constantly facing.
Yeah.
And I don't know what makes this genre so unique to all of this. I mean, I'm still perplexed by that. But I do, when you said that all the veterans were still there in the 80s,
Yeah.
and then here we are competing with them coming in, and I'm thinking, what's different now about the jazz festivals?
Right.
Is it because now record companies have to make shit up, excuse me? Because, you know, Miles was a personality. Just his name would put people in the seats. So the same jazz festival that would sell out because Miles was there now has to put, you know, with all due respect, you know, the Pips and you know,
Yep.
you know what I'm talking about. You know, the OJs and everything in the same seats. So is it that we did define the music, that we were the ones, and when I say we, I mean you, the artists, were the ones that defined the music, and now the young lines have to be made up by the record labels
Right.
to somehow offset that those great artists were beginning to pass on. So we didn't have Dizzy anymore. You know, we couldn't, you know, make our flight 6 months in advance to Montreux because we know we're going to see Dizzy. So maybe it had to do with how those people who were used to generating all this money and income, as you say, for themselves. Now we got to come up with something else because we can't count on so and so and so to come in and do what our great Dizzy has done. But you crystallized all of that for me, having lived in that same time as a performer with Geri.
Yeah.
And now you're helping me to understand what that journey and how she navigated that so elegantly
Right.
that leaves us all still so, you know, perplexed because she did it so beautifully. She's so supposed to be here showing us how to do that.
Exactly.
So I sincerely got to tell you, it's not for you. I don't know if we would even have the same experience.
That's right.
this
Oh,
weekend.
come on.
So
That's
thank
right.
you.
Yeah.
Let me answer your question about where I think it's gone. I think the nature of the technology of today makes us all a little more interconnected. I mean, you know, like, I'm just always surprised who's connected to who when I go on Facebook.
Yes.
Like, you know, I know I couldn't talk to you about the AACM in 1982, so why are you connected to them now? I just think when we talk about jazz up until 60s, 70s, we're talking about an ethnic music that people are entertained by internationally about ethnicity.
Right.
And then we made it about something. First, we disqualified all the young guys unless they were wearing suits. And then it became this kind of, well, what is it really? And it's got to be about technique, or it's got to be about something flashy. We got to come up with some, is somebody really young? Is somebody really cute? Is somebody used to be a junkie, but they're not a junkie anymore, and we can write about that? Like there always had to be
A hook.
a kind of a hook, which in press terms, that's why I could never get away from the klezmer story. It was the flashiest thing that could be said about me at any point. But if you talk about marketing a TV show, you're also thinking about that.
Right.
And we are actually, as an idiom, we are competing with all these things. You can stay home and watch all the stuff you ever want to watch. Mm-hmm. So how do you get somebody out? Okay, so it's not an ethnic show anymore. What is it? And we can continue to not admit how racialized people's following of various musics is. Mm-hmm. We can continue, somebody like Stanley Crouch, that's one thing he will do. He will go and say, that's some white shit. But what are we saying about John Zorn?
Yeah.
Is that some black shit? Yeah. No, it's not. Separate audience, separate audience, separate marketing. Is Winton about some black stuff? Well, he's not about some white stuff, but he's not exactly. You hear Crouch and he'll say jazz has nothing to do with Africa and stuff like that. Okay, that's what you think, fine. But I don't think that's true. Mm. But, in doing that, they opened the idiom up to more people as long as they were running it. As long as they were running it and gatekeeping it, it could be cool for everybody. But was the ethnic thing what people were loving about jazz before the 1970s? Was it or wasn't it? And if it is what people were loving about jazz in the 70s, what have we replaced it with? What's charming about jazz? You see Ella Fitzgerald, she's a bad cat. She's charming. She's super colored. Colored would be the word we would use in that era. She's colored. All right? What are we selling now? I don't really think of anybody of our era as being particularly folksy colored in that kind of way. With all due respect to Esperanza, I don't see that. I think that the ethnic feeling, even that it's exclusively American, has disappeared. And that it's all, in the end, it's either about a lot of technique or playing absolutely free. But what's being sold, the essence of what I get when I hear Roy Eldridge, nobody's selling that now. And I just say Roy Eldridge because, to me, he's not like burning innovative, but, there was a center of something very ethnic. And if that's not being sold, what are we selling?
Can I ask you, along those lines, do you hear hip hop as ethnic music?
Of course,
that way?
But it's like everything that we come up with, it's not exclusively black at this point. But I think it's ethnic, but not necessarily. I'm going to say something terrible about hip hop, and then everybody's going to come down on me. But the level of compositional exploration in it. If we take out the Tribe and the Wu-Tang and the people that were really hearing some other stuff, I don't think it's at the same level of jazz, but it's ethnic. Yes, it is ethnic, and that's what people like about it.
And how about gospel music?
Well, gospel music, that's my thing. And gospel music, I think, is unique because it's really, in the past 20 years, like, Kirk Franklin, Twinkie Clark, what these people are doing, these are miracles of composition. And there's a religious and ethnic thing that cannot be broken. It just cannot be broken. They're all mixed together. Is that a high volume pop music? I would say not. They make money. And they make money within the community, which us jazz folks, we don't do. That I would say is pure on an ethnic level. But I mean, if we say that with taking the race out of it, we're Americans, what are we selling? You know, America is Trump. America is, it's a lot of different things. There's a lot of different things that we could sell as being American. If it's not black music, what are we selling? That's my question.
So we have a mic here, actually. Okay.
So, okay, so now we have the smooth jazz phenomenon.
Well, that's always.
Isn't that like the biggest thing that's being sold now? And how can we get away from that? Is there some type of alliance maybe that we could make with, say, I'm just trying to think of like maybe in the classical world?
Classical music and smooth jazz.
No, authentic jazz. More like, what you were talking about, coming from the community.
Fusing authentic jazz, quote unquote, as you said, and smooth jazz? Is that what your question is?
No, I think that's the problem. What I'm saying is jazz that is in the community, fusing that with maybe classical.
Okay.
What is an alternative to smooth?
That doesn't sound like a
jazz?
high yield prescription. I mean, in terms of numbers. It's already been done. I mean, with Milt Jackson, the Modern Jazz Quartet. I mean, yeah. It's already. I'm not sure what you're getting at, but I will say this. I feel like smooth jazz is not the automatic diss that a lot of people in serious jazz think that it is. If you respect the kind of language that R&B singers use,
Right.
then you have to respect the smooth jazz guys that can spit that.
Certain one.
Like George Duke, Gerald Albright. I can listen
Grover
to a
Washington.
Gerald Albright solo and go like, oh yeah, well, blah blah blah. Like okay, but like different references, like, oh well, that's a kind of thing that Patti LaBelle would play in a spot. So I don't automatically diss that music. I know it's much more popular than normal jazz or serious jazz. I hate using any kind of word like that, but like whatever we're talking about, more mainstream traditional jazz. It's not like that. But I think the interest level in our community, we can't really compete. I can go on like several channels in my cable package and come up with some hip hop if I just turned on my cable. But nobody's really seeing any jazz. Even on a Winton tip. Maybe a couple times a year they put them on live at Lincoln Center, but those aren't great numbers. Those aren't great numbers. Yeah.
So this goes back to what you said about ethnic identity being a reason that audiences were coming to jazz pre-'70s. Do you really trust that white audiences were coming to the table for the right reason in terms of crossing an ethnic barrier, that they were really trying to understand the Black American experience through this music, or they were more like, people coming up from rich neighborhoods and cabs to Harlem in the 40s just to get this like a foreign exotic experience.
Wow,
you
that's
know?
that's like a whole fantasy, like taking the cab. Where should we get out? No, let's put it this way. We could spend a whole we could have a whole symposium on just how white folks got into this music in Europe and here and why and how. You know, here we had segregated jazz. And some people have stayed with that, you know, the Buddy Rich, but they just stay with that, and they don't really listen to black music. And some people only listen to black music, which pissed off a lot of white musicians. You know what I mean? We could spend eons just talking just about that. So that's to me, that's not a quick question. It's not a quick question. Are you into Ella Fitzgerald for the right reason? Well, you know, if I go to see Luciano Pavarotti, he's Italian, I ain't Italian. He's classical music, I'm not supposed to know anything about that, but that's not really true. But I can go see him. I can like him because he's Italian. I can like him because he's overweight. I can like him because he really looks the part. All of those things are reasons why, you know, is it unfair for somebody to like somebody because they're black? Shit. If I listen to Lightning Hopkins, what else could I be thinking about except that he's black and from the South and he knows how to do that. He knows how to express that. So I don't think it's an unhealthy reason or unfair to white people that like somehow some white people like some stuff because it's ethnically black. You know, it doesn't have to be a race. It can be an ethnicity.
Right. That's
Well, I'm hearing the subject for the next symposium, perhaps, that we could gather around all this stuff. I'm just mindful that we're supposed to break for lunch.
I got it.
And thank our panelists for giving us such a stimulating conversation.
I do want to say one thing, just just to contextualize some of this, because this was about Geri, and we are still actually talking about Geri. But you put into words some things about Mr. Marsalis that are kind of at odds with some things that have happened here at Harvard, but that needed to be said. And I want to say that part of our ethos and our impulse for first having that symposium at Radcliffe 2 years ago that brought Geri here, and then having this, is to kind of create a counterbalance to a certain Winton-centric or a certain narrative that took hold here at Harvard itself, with Winton doing a series of lectures and then and performances that had a huge kind of embraced by the university, and were recently launched as an online course without the consultation of the music department. So it's not like we're chopped liver.
Like we're chopped liver. Yeah.
So he's been a kind of ongoing presence here in ways that we would like to at least have a dialogue about. And so it's really important that you said what you said today, and that it is now in the archive here, and that we'll all remember it and carry that forward with us. So thank you.
Yes.